Welcome to Whispers of the Moon. Tonight we delve into the shadows of New England, where centuries of ghostly tales and strange phenomena linger like a chill in the air. Settle in, because these three stories are not for the faint of heart. Are you ready? Let's begin. Story 1. The Curse of Dudleytown, Connecticut. They called it a ghost town, a place so cursed that it had been abandoned for over a century. But to Mia, it was just another adventure. Her friends rolled their eyes when she brought it up. Dudleytown isn't just abandoned, Nate had warned her. It's cursed. The settlers there? They went insane. People died mysteriously. They say the land itself is evil. Mia had laughed it off. It's just an old legend. Come on, aren't you curious? But Nate had refused to join her. You'll regret it, he'd said. Undeterred, Mia set off on her own one crisp October morning. The air was cool and the forest was alive with the golden hues of autumn. Armed with a backpack and a sense of adventure, she followed the trail leading into the infamous woods. At first, it was peaceful. Too peaceful. The deeper she went, the quieter it became. The cheerful chirping of birds and rustle of leaves seemed to vanish, replaced by an unnatural stillness. The only sound was her own footsteps crunching on the forest floor. After an hour, her GPS began to glitch. The blue dot on the map spun in circles, refusing to anchor. She tapped the screen in frustration. Great. Guess I'll have to do this the old-fashioned way. She glanced around, suddenly uneasy. The trees seemed to press in closer, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky. That's when she saw it, a shadow moving between the trees. It was quick, almost too quick to catch, but it was there. Hello? She called, her voice trembling. No answer. The shadow was gone. She told herself it was just her imagination, but her pace quickened. Minutes later, she reached a small clearing. In the center stood the ruins of an old stone foundation, overgrown with moss and vines. This had to be part of Dudleytown. She took a step closer, but a sudden chill ran down her spine. The temperature had dropped and the air smelled faintly of sulfur. Then she saw him. A man stood at the edge of the clearing, his figure barely visible in the shadows of the trees. His clothes were tattered and his face was pale and gaunt, his eyes hollow and lifeless. "Excuse me?" Mia called hesitantly. "Do you live around here?" The man didn't respond. He didn't move. He just stared at her with those empty eyes. Her heart pounded. Something was wrong. Every instinct screamed at her to leave, but her legs felt rooted to the ground. Slowly, the man began to walk toward her, his movements jerky and unnatural. Mia stumbled backward, tripping over a root and landing hard on the ground. Pain shot through her wrist, but she barely noticed. The man was closer now, his face contorted into a snarl. His lips moved, but no sound came out, just a chilling, guttural rasp. She scrambled to her feet and ran. The trees blurred past her, branches tearing at her clothes and skin. Behind her, she could hear the man's heavy, uneven footsteps, faster than they should have been. "Leave." The word was whispered on the wind, low and guttural, but it wasn't coming from the man. It was all around her. Panic consumed her. She didn't know where she was going. The trail was gone. The forest seemed alive, shifting and twisting to keep her trapped. She glanced over her shoulder and screamed. The man was there, impossibly close, his mouth stretched into an unnatural grin, teeth blackened and sharp. Mia's lungs burned as she pushed herself harder. The whispers grew louder, overlapping in an incomprehensible cacophony. Her vision blurred with tears. She burst through the trees and onto a paved road, collapsing onto the asphalt. When she looked back, the forest was calm and still, bathed in sunlight. There was no sign of the man or the whispers, but the feeling of being watched lingered. She didn't go home right away. She sat in her car for hours, shaking and staring at the tree line. That night at home, Mia dreamt of hollow eyes watching her from the darkness. And when she woke, she sat up. There was dirt under her fingernails and the faint scent of sulfur in the air. She looked around. She was back in the clearing, sitting up amongst the stone ruins. The curse of Dudleytown had claimed her. Story 2. The Devil's Footprint, Massachusetts. Emily always scoffed at ghost stories. She was a historian, a woman of logic and facts, but Even she had to admit the Hoosac Tunnel had a dark past. More than 200 men had died during its construction in the 1800s. Cave-ins, explosions, drownings. The locals called it the Bloody Pit, claiming it was cursed. But curses didn't exist. That's what Emily told herself the night she ventured into the tunnel during a freak storm. The wind howled like a wounded animal as rain lashed the small town of North Adams. Emily's research project on New England legends had brought her here. She wanted to capture the storm's eerie atmosphere and maybe something unusual. Armed with her camera and flashlight, she stepped into the gaping mouth of the tunnel. Instantly, the storm's fury was muted, replaced by an oppressive silence. The only sound was the rhythmic drip of water echoing from the walls. Her flashlight cast long, trembling shadows on the slick stone. She walked deeper, her boots crunching on gravel. A strange smell hung in the air, metallic, almost like blood. She paused to adjust her camera, the beam of her flashlight slicing through the darkness. That's when she heard it. Footsteps. At first they were faint, blending with the echo of her own movements. But as she stood still, they grew louder, deliberate. They weren't hers. "Hello?" she called, her voice unnaturally loud in the confined space. The footsteps stopped. Her heart pounded as she scanned the tunnel with her flashlight. The beam landed on the ground a few feet ahead, and she gasped. A massive hoofprint was scorched into the stone, the edges still smoking faintly. "No way," she muttered, her breath fogging the air. The Devil's Footprint. It was one of the oldest legends about the tunnel. According to the story, workers had once held a seance deep in the tunnel to contact the spirits of their dead comrades. Instead, they summoned something else. The footprint was said to be proof of its arrival. Emily snapped a photo, her hands trembling. That's when the air changed. The temperature plummeted and her breath came in visible puffs. A deep, guttural growl rumbled through the tunnel, vibrating in her chest. "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice cracking. The growl grew louder, reverberating from all directions. Her flashlight flickered, plunging her into near darkness. She fumbled with it, her pulse racing. When the beam steadied, she nearly dropped it. Two glowing red eyes stared back at her from the black void, unblinking and impossibly large. They hovered several feet above the ground, far taller than any person. Emily froze, unable to move or even scream. The eyes advanced, and with each step the sound of hooves clattered against the stone. The sulfuric smell grew stronger, choking her. "You shouldn't have come here," a voice hissed, deep and guttural, yet almost human. Emily backed away, her foot slipping on the wet ground. She hit the wall of the tunnel, her flashlight shaking violently in her grip. The red eyes were closer now, and she could make out a shadowy form, hulking with jagged horns scraping the tunnel's ceiling. Its teeth gleamed, sharp and too many. Desperate, Emily turned and ran. The growl erupted into a deafening roar behind her, and the ground beneath her feet trembled. She didn't dare look back. The tunnel seemed endless, stretching farther than it should have. Her legs burned and her lungs felt like they might burst. Just as she thought she couldn't go any farther, she stumbled out into the storm. Rain and wind pelted her, but she didn't care. She sprinted to her car, throwing herself inside and locking the doors. She sat there, drenched and shaking, staring at the tunnel's entrance. It loomed in the darkness, silent and unyielding. But something moved within, two faint red lights fading into the shadows. The next day, Emily returned with a team of investigators. They found her camera lying in the tunnel, its lens cracked, where she had dropped it as she scrambled out of the tunnel the night before. The last photo it had captured was of the scorched hoofprint, and in the background, something large and shadowy loomed, its eyes burning red. Some say the devil guards his footprint in the Hoosac Tunnel, and those who trespass may not return. Would you dare to enter? Story 3. Mercy Brown, the Vampire of Exeter, Rhode Island. It was supposed to be just a thrill, a late-night dare in the dead of autumn. Jack had heard about the legend of Mercy Brown from Clara, his girlfriend, who had grown up in the small town of Exeter. She was a vampire, Clara had said, her voice low and conspiratorial. When her family started dying of tuberculosis, the townspeople dug her up. They found her body fresh with no signs of decay and fresh blood in her mouth. People say she was feeding on her family. Jack had laughed. You don't really believe that, do you? But Clara's expression was serious. People say her spirit still haunts Chestnut Hill Cemetery. If you visit her grave at night, strange things happen. Jack couldn't resist. He convinced Clara to go with him, jokingly calling it a Halloween warm-up. She reluctantly agreed, but only if they promised not to stay long. That night, the sky was moonless, and a dense fog clung to the ground as they made their way up the dirt path to the cemetery. Clara held a flashlight, its weak beam barely piercing the darkness. Jack carried nothing but a smirk. "Are you sure this is it?" he asked as they passed rows of weathered headstones. Clara nodded, pointing to a granite marker at the edge of the cemetery. The name Mercy Brown was carved into the stone, along with the dates of her birth and death. The grave looked ordinary, unassuming. Jack knelt and brushed the damp leaves from the stone. "Mercy," he said mockingly, knocking on the headstone. "You home? Don't do that," Clara hissed, pulling him back to his feet. He laughed. "What's the worst that could happen? Is she going to crawl out and get me?" A sudden gust of wind cut through the cemetery, cold and biting. Clara shivered, her breath visible in the frigid air. "We should go," she whispered. But before they could leave, a low moan rose from the shadows. It was faint at first, almost like the wind, but it grew louder, echoing through the graveyard. Jack froze, his smirk fading. "Did you hear that?" Clara asked, her voice barely audible. Jack nodded, his bravado slipping. The moan became a wail, high-pitched and agonized, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Clara's flashlight flickered, casting erratic beams across the tombstones. Then they saw her. A pale figure stood at the edge of the cemetery, barely visible through the fog. She wore a tattered white dress stained with something dark, and her hair hung in wet, stringy clumps. Her face was gaunt, her eyes sunken and black. Blood dripped from her mouth, glistening in the dim light. "Run!" Clara whispered, her voice trembling. Jack was rooted to the spot, unable to look away. The figure began to move, her skeletal hand reaching toward them. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, like a marionette pulled by invisible strings. "Run!" Clara screamed, grabbing his arm and yanking him backward. They bolted down the path, their breaths ragged and panicked. The wailing followed them, rising and falling like a maddening siren. Jack dared to glance back and immediately wished he hadn't. Mercy was gliding after them, her feet not touching the ground, her hollow eyes locked onto his. They reached the car and Jack fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking uncontrollably. The locks clicked and they scrambled inside. Jack started the engine, but before he could shift into drive, Clara let out a blood-curdling scream. Mercy was pressed against the passenger window, her face inches from Clara's. Her blackened eyes bore into them, and her mouth curled into a grin, revealing sharp, blood-stained teeth. Jack slammed on the gas. The car screeched down the narrow road, the figure disappearing into the fog behind them. For a moment, they sat in silence, the car's engine the only sound. Jack's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. Clara clutched her arms, her body trembling. "I told you this was a bad idea," she whispered. Jack didn't respond. His chest felt tight and a cold sweat drenched his back. When they got home, he went straight to bed, too shaken to speak. That night, Clara woke to the sound of coughing. She turned to find Jack sitting upright, his face pale, his lips tinged with blood. "Jack," she whispered, shaking him. He didn't respond. His eyes were wide, staring at something only he could see. On his chest, in the faint glow of the streetlight through the window, were 4 long, bloodied scratches. Mercy Brown's legend endures, a chilling reminder of the fear that lurks in the shadows of New England's past. Do you believe in vampires? Thank you for joining me on this journey into the terrifying tales of New England. If these stories sent shivers down your spine, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more chilling tales from Whispers of the Moon. Until next time, keep your lights on and your doors locked. Sweet dreams.